Yeah. Okay, professors, you are getting in, right? You are. Please mute yourselves. Would you mute everybody? Oh my God.
Somebody's not happy.
Kids. Yeah. Okay. Now everybody is in now almost. Lucky they are coming in one by one. We will begin anyways. I don't know, Dr. Are you in? Dr. Nasir Rich is our head of the department, so I just making sure that he is have joined us. دكتور محمد دكتور نصير دخل ولا لا؟ أي موجود. Okay. All right, we will begin now. I would like to say just a few words on behalf of the College of Art and in particular Department of English, and on behalf of the head of the department, Dr. Nasir. We are so pleased to welcome Professor Richard Carl Raymond. He's actually the former head of the English department in Mississippi State University, a teacher for a very long time and of 20th century American and English literature. And he is the author of several books, actually, especially the one that he wrote after he'd been in Kosovo as a Fulbrighter. He's the publisher of Writings, Visions of Hope. Please, the professor, mute your. He is so the author of reading and writing courses, replacing literature in composition, another book questioning and calling literary and rhetorical analysis for writers. He's also the author of Teaching American Literature at an East European university. He's still teaching in Wyoming State University, and of course is still in MSU, giving online courses and of course face-to-face courses. We are so pleased to welcome you, Rich. But before we begin, I need just to tell the professors that we are so happy to have you with us. Please try to mute yourselves all the time, unless you want to have like raise a question when you want to ask after the presentation is over. Would you please just raise your hand, and you will be you know, only having limited one question. So try to be well organized as much as we can. We are so happy to have you, Richard. So we go. The mic is for you. Rich, us? Do you hear me? Please, others, would you mute yourselves?
Hello?
Yes, do you hear me?
You can't hear me?
I can hear you. Just 1 minute, Dr. Mohammed, please mute everybody. ممكن تسوي mute.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, just some of them still, you know, not able to operate the program, the application, so they don't know how to keep themselves muted.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. دكتورة عنان اسمعيني من فضلك. اوكي
ده اسمعك دكتور، تفضل.
اوكي هسه صار ميوت فور اول.
Should I begin?
Yes, please, Rich.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, well, I want to thank you all for hosting me. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I know you're all concerned with something called critical appraisal. And I also know that many of you have attended a session by Dr. Mike Cardos, where he talked about the teaching of creative writing, which is his specialty. But I would like to focus on critical appraisal of the sort in which students are asked to write critical appraisals, either about nonfiction texts, fiction, poetry, or even critical appraisals of their own work, which is what I'll get to last. I have sent Anand 3 PDFs, which I think are going to be either available to you all now or will be. The first one is on that first subject of teaching students to write critical appraisals of nonfiction, fiction. And then the second PDF focuses on teaching students to write critical appraisals on poetry. And then the third one focuses on reflective writing, which is the kind of critical assessment where students are assessing their own work, determining to what degree they see growth as writers. And that same process can be used for departments to assess the effectiveness of their teaching. So lots to cover here. I'll try to keep things moving along. And please interrupt me at any point if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Okay, I'm trying to get to my slides. And then how do I minimize the screen so I can get to my slides? Exit full screen. Okay, here we go. All right, here we go. So the title of this is Critical Appraisals or Teaching Students to Write Reflectively. Where I begin to teach students how to write critical appraisals of other people's writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, is I start by introducing, really I go back to Aristotle and teach them what he called the elements of persuasion. Because anytime we're writing a critical appraisal, we're essentially writing an argument. We're trying to convince an audience that we are making a valid claim, that we can support the claim with evidence. And so that goes back to the elements of rhetoric or the elements of persuasion. So the first one, according to, I'm using Aristotle's Greek terminology here, ethos. And by ethos, he meant the credible image that we try to create either as speakers or as writers. He broke that down into 3 parts. He said
Excuse me, Rich, I'm sorry, but like we don't see the slide yet. We don't, yeah. So like you, as we did before, you can, cancel it and reopen it again, as we did before.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wonder why we didn't have any trouble with that yesterday.
I don't know, but just to try with share content and then from Zoom and then, yeah.
Okay, that's what I left out. I'm sorry. Here we go.
Let's see. Okay. Okay, now
we see. I'm sorry.
Yes. Very good. Okay, thank you.
Everybody see it now? Can you hear me?
Okay, it's clear.
Everyone's still able to hear me? Hello? Are you not able to hear me? Oh boy.
No, I can hear you, Rich. I can hear you. It was open. You closed it. Yes, now. دكتور محمد إذا ممكن عافية يعني أنت لا تسويني ميوت من يمك please.
لا
I
أنا
will-
ما سويتش ميوت، أنت اللي سويتي ميوت على الجهاز الموبايل مال
Okay.
حضرتك أو اللابتوب.
Okay. Okay, Rich, you can go ahead, please. It's
Okay.
fine. Yes, please go ahead.
So I think this is where we were. The first element of persuasion that Aristotle talked about was ethos. And that is the image that we create, whether we're writing or speaking. We want an audience to believe what we're saying. And Aristotle said, well, if you want that to happen, you have to convince your audience that, number one, that you're informed. That is, that you know what you're talking about. You have done your homework on the topic at hand. And you have information to demonstrate that that information. They have to be persuaded too that you're generous. All that means is that you are perceived as a writer or speaker who actually cares about the audience. If you're going to do critical appraisal, the audience needs to believe that your heart as well as your head is in the right place, and that you care about them, not just about yourself. And the third element of ethos, according to Aristotle, is honesty. Now, I like to use with my students an example from American history, which dates me as a very old man, but it's still a good example of the key nature of honesty as part of ethos. And I refer here to President Richard Nixon. Here's a man who spent most of his adult life trying to become president of the United States. He succeeded twice, but near the beginning of his second term, the Watergate scandal happened. You may know the story, but it's essentially about a break-in of Democratic headquarters, and then he lied about knowing anything about that. And the cover-up caused everybody to think that he was basically a liar. So Richard Nixon, even his most severe critics agree that he was an intelligent man. He was informed, particularly in matters of world affairs. They believe that he loved his country. He was generous. He served in the Navy in World War II, for example. But with regard to honesty, after the Watergate scandal, they were calling him Tricky Dick. And he was smart enough to figure out that, well, if people don't believe me, I can't govern. And that's when he resigned the presidency. So Aristotle was right that all three of these elements are critical to, if you're trying to establish a critical appraisal of a text, you must appear to know what you're talking about, to care about your audience, and to be telling the truth. Second element of persuasion, according to Aristotle, is logos, from which we derive the word logic. And by that he meant our management of ideas. That divides into two parts. Evidence certainly relates to your concern with critical appraisal, because without evidence, you really can't support your claims. What does evidence mean? Well, it comes in different shapes. It could be facts, it could be statistics, it could be a case history that relates to the topic. It could be expert testimony, where you quote somebody in the field known for expertise. And also personal experience, if it's relevant, can be extremely persuasive. And then the second part of logos is reasoning, the inductive and deductive patterns. And we really don't have too much time to get into that today, but basically he was making the point that you can't simply throw your evidence at your audience at random and expect them to be able to follow it. You need to arrange it in such a way that they can follow your chain of reasoning from evidence to conclusion. And then the third element of persuasion he called pathos, emotional appeal. If we were all totally rational creatures, we wouldn't need pathos, but of course we're not. We respond to information emotionally as well as intellectually. So Aristotle said, if you want to build emotional passion to your work, to your critical appraisal, try writing some parallel sentence structures. Try using words that have a connotative value, an explosive emotional appeal to them. And then even arrangement. If you have a major argument, you probably want to save it for the end, the last point at which you have to touch your audience. So those are three elements of persuasion. And I start off my students, introducing them to those terms, because when they write their own critical appraisals, they're basically going to be using, if they're going to succeed, they're going to have ethos, logos, and pathos. And if any of those elements are missing, it probably won't be a very successful piece of writing. So what I want to first advocate here is a way to help students get to the point where they could actually write these quite challenging critical appraisals of somebody else's writing. It's a technique called journaling. I certainly didn't invent that word, but it's what I call it. And it's a pre-writing technique that gets students ready to write those formal papers where they make the critical appraisals. My first example that I'd like to use is from Martin Luther King's essay from Birmingham jail. Some of you may know this famous piece of writing. It's not only a powerful example of rhetoric, but it's very important to American history. It was written way back in 1963, when Martin Luther King, the American civil rights leader, was quite literally in jail in Birmingham, Alabama. He was there because he and his people had led a nonviolent march of protest against the racist government in Birmingham at that time. Well, as he expected, they got arrested for breaking the law. While he was in jail, King was publicly criticized by fellow clergymen. Keep in mind, Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. And these people who criticized him in a newspaper editorial wrote a very polite letter, published it in the paper, and in the politest of language, it said basically, why don't you get out of town? Why don't you go back to Atlanta where you came from? You have no business here. You're just making trouble. Imagine how you would feel if you were sitting in jail for trying to establish peace and justice, and then you're critically condemned by your peers for being rash and violent. So this first question, again, I have my students read the letter from Birmingham jail. And by the way, it's in the PDF called King file. So you can read the entire letter for yourself. It's about 15 pages long. It's quite long. But this first journaling question, what I have my students do is wrestle with just the first 3 paragraphs of the letter with regard to King's effort to establish ethos. Now remember, ethos means credibility. And the people who wrote that letter thought that he had no credibility. They thought he was a troublemaker from outside Alabama. They didn't want to hear anything that he had to say. So he had to establish his credibility, his ethos, as a man worth listening to. In the first 3 paragraphs, you'll see this when you open up the PDF. In the first paragraph, he mentions, because they asked the question, well, what are you doing here? You don't belong in Alabama. Well, he points out that he is the leader of the Christian Leadership Conference, which was established in the entire Southeast. He's president of the organization. And the first thing he says to these critics is, well, I was invited here. I didn't just show up. People in Alabama in my organization called the Christian Leadership Conference said, please come help us. So I did that. So he says at the end of that paragraph, let me quote from it. He says, this is on page 138, if you've got the PDF on King. He says, this is the last sentence of that first paragraph. He says, I feel you are men of genuine goodwill. Now, again, consider these are fellow clergymen who publicly condemned him and criticized him for being there. And yet he's willing to say, I think you are men of goodwill. I'm going to accept you as that. And so therefore he says, I'm going to reply to your criticisms, what he calls patient and reasonable terms. That's ethos building I hope my students will realize, because it's the opposite of what they assume about him. They think he's a hothead, a troublemaker. He says, no, I'm going to try to answer your concerns, and I'm going to do that patiently and reasonably. The second journal question here is about what he's up to in paragraphs 6 to 11, which you'll find on page 139 if you've got the PDF file. You don't have to go through all of this, but here's what he's doing in these 5 paragraphs is that he's talking very calmly, very serenely about the process that he and his people went through before they hit the streets to make their demonstration. He talks about their self-purification process. He talks about the humiliation of having persuaded the Birmingham leaders to take down racially insulting signs, which they did, but then quickly put them back up. He talks about, in paragraph 8, how he and his people had actual workshops on nonviolence, where they learned the principles taught, of course, by lots of famous people like Gandhi, Jesus of Nazareth, Henry David Thoreau. All of them advocated civil disobedience, particularly nonviolent civil disobedience. So what King is trying to do to build his own ethos in this 5-paragraph section is to explain that, yeah, they were getting ready to make protests in the street, but they weren't violent protests. They had no guns, they had no clubs. They were just going to march to make people aware of the injustice. I really like this third question. Students who journal on this get a lot of good information that they could use in their essays. It asks them to find 5 allusions, 5 references to famous people or events within the letter. And they're all over the place. You could almost at random stick your finger on a paragraph and find a reference like this. But let me give you a few examples, because you see it, the question says, how do these allusions build King's ethos and his logos? Remember, logos means, his evidence. Ethos is his credibility. Well, here are some examples. Remember, he's writing to clergymen. Most of the clergymen in his immediate audience are Christian theologians. Some of them are Jewish. I think there might have been one Muslim. But one allusion that he makes found quite impressive. This starts on page 142 in the PDF, if you've got it. He refers to 2 theologians. One by the name of Martin Buber, and the other one is Paul Tillich. Martin Buber is a Jewish theologian. Paul Tillich is a famous Christian theologian, both in the 20th century, which again is when King was writing. But he's not just dropping names here that he knew clergymen would recognize because they were theologians, but he quotes what they say. When he's talking about Martin Buber, he reminds him that he's the philosopher that talked about how important it is that when we're doing any kind of critical appraisal for an audience, we need to establish what he called the I-thou or I-you relationship, not the I-it relationship. Of course, segregation, those racist laws of Alabama back then, were all about I-it. I'm the white man, I'm in charge. You're the black man, you don't matter. You're an it. Well, King reminds them, again, remember some of these clergymen were Jewish. They would definitely know the name Martin Buber. And he doesn't just mention that name, he says, he's the man who taught you to establish an I-you relationship with your audience. Paul Tillich, I know the Christian theologians recognized that man because he is famous for many sermons that he gave and essays that he published. But probably his most famous phrase from Paul Tillich is this. He said, "Sin is separation." Well, that's King's point here. Segregation laws are all about separation. So he's mentioning a famous theologian, Christian theologian, quoting his famous line about how, by definition, segregation laws, which are unjust to Black people, are sinful. And again, his immediate audience were all clergy, just like he was. So this is bound to at least get their attention. And I would think at that point, it would make them very uncomfortable remembering that they had criticized this man who obviously holds the values that they do. A couple other quick examples of allusions. He refers to St. Augustine, early Christian theologian. An allusion could be a historical reference. He refers to, in American history, a very famous event that you may know of called the Boston Tea Party back in the 18th century when the American Revolution was starting. Why were they having a revolution? Why were they protesting? Well, they were protesting unfair taxes. So he's saying, you know, assuming they would know their history, that you all reverence the Boston Tea Party. Please remember that the white men who threw the tea in the harbor to protest the unfair taxes were practicing nonviolent civil disobedience, which is exactly what I and my people are doing. I really like he alludes to Adolf Hitler. Sounds like a strange thing to allude to in such an essay, but here's what he does with that allusion. He reminds them, because the clergymen were really concerned that King had just disrupted order on the streets, what he's trying to do is remind them of the difference between order and justice. And he reminds them, I think this is on page what? When I've lost my page reference, but he reminds them that during the Nazi regime, everything that Adolf Hitler required as a law to create order was legal, including persecution of Jews, of course. Even the murder of Jews. It's all legal. He's the law. He makes the law. In the same sentence, he reminds his readers that at the same time that Hitler was pronouncing himself the law, the Hungarian freedom fighters were resisting his injustice and risking their own lives to save Jews who are running from Nazi tyranny. So in other words, I hope my students journal on number 3 here, they'll realize that all these allusions are not just dropping famous names. It's a matter of providing examples and quotations from famous people, famous events, all of which have to do with the importance of justice and the need to get rid of injustice. Here are a few more prompts. We won't dwell on all of these, but again, it's quite a long essay. It's about 15 pages or so. So a lot of journal questions. This first one here that you're looking at now focuses on paragraphs 8 through 10, and then paragraphs 20 through 22. Again, they're all in that PDF that you will have, where he explains his theory of civil disobedience. And of course, again, that's a theory that he borrows from Mahatma Gandhi, from Christ, from Thoreau. He alludes to all of them. The second question there about other allusions that are designed, actually not just allusions, but other kinds of figurative language, metaphor and simile. The journal question says, come up with at least 3 examples of metaphor or simile that explain why the comparison clarifies King's displeasure with what he calls the white moderate. And let me just read to you briefly from one paragraph where he's talking about the white moderates. And the white moderates were white people at the time, 1963, who claimed that they agreed with King. They thought that, yes, we ought to have brotherhood, but they were unwilling to do anything about it. And King thought that their liberal tolerance was really counterproductive. And to make that point, he uses metaphorical language. Let me read some of it to you here. This is paragraph 24. It's on page 143 of the PDF, if you've got it open. He says, as I read here, listen to not only the metaphoric language, but the parallel rhythms of the sentences. You'll hear, I had hoped, I had hoped, I had hoped, over and over again to emphasize his displeasure. He says, I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice. And that when they fail in this purpose, they become, and here's the first metaphor that I hope my students pick out, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from the obnoxious negative peace, which the Negro has passively accepted as his unjust plight, to a substantive and positive peace. Again, you hear the parallel sentence rhythms surrounding the use of figurative language. Skipping down a few lines here, here's the end of the paragraph. Listen to this use of simile to emphasize his point about the evil of segregation. We, meaning his people who are doing the protesting, we bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. And here's the simile. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all of its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed with all of its tension and its exposure creates. And here's another comparison, to the light of human conscience and to the air of national opinion before it can be cured. So again, eventually my students will be writing an essay critically appraising King's blending of ethos, logos, and pathos. And if they answered this journal question, they've got evidence right there that they can use in their essay. They can not just claim that King uses metaphorical language, but they could actually quote his references to the dams blocking social progress, or to the boil of racist segregation that must be lanced so that it can be cured by the air and the light of national discourse. Last example here, number 3, on this journaling prompt. How does King blend logos and pathos in paragraph 25 and 45? Let's just look at paragraph 45. It's near the end of his essay, and you'll find that if you've got the PDF at the bottom of page 148. This is a very short paragraph, but it's one where he's answering their concern about the Birmingham Police Department. The critics of King praised the police because they were nonviolent when they arrested King and his people. Of course, what they don't realize is that once they got them into the jail, they were not nonviolent at all. And this paragraph describes that. I'll read the whole thing to you because it's quite short. He says, before closing, I feel impelled to mention one other point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping, quote, order and for, quote, preventing violence. Here's the response to that. I doubt that you would have so warmly commended the police force, if you had seen its dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here and in the city jail. If you were to see them slap, kick old Negro men and young boys, if you were to observe them, as I did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. Keep in mind, he's addressing clergymen. And the last very pithy last sentence says, I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. So what I'm trying to suggest to your colleagues is that if you expect your students to write a critical appraisal of a very lengthy and challenging piece of nonfiction, such as the letter from Birmingham jail, the best way that I know of to prepare them to do that is to not only ask, but require them to keep a journal. It can be a handwritten journal. It could be I now use a totally online journal. But the point is, if they wrestle with these analytical questions, in doing that, they're gathering the evidence that they will need that they can almost literally cut and paste into their own essays. If they haven't done this journaling, they sit down to write the paper and realize they don't have a clue where to start. Moving on, because the clock is ticking, another extension of the emphasis on ethos, logos, and pathos is that I invite my students complete change of pace here. Instead of writing an essay analyzing King's work, oh, and by the way, I meant to mention a second ago that if you look in the PDF on page 150 through 152, you'll find there just a brilliant piece of student writing. It's written by a former student of mine. And guess what he's writing about? He's assessing, he's doing a critical appraisal of King's letter from Birmingham jail. And if you'll permit me, before we get to Susan Glaspell, let me just read you a brief excerpt from his essay. He wrote basically a 5-paragraph essay, but it's quite substantial. In the introduction, it's really well done, but let me just read you the last sentence where he presents his thesis. Again, his assignment was to write a critical appraisal of King's letter, and I gave them their choice of focuses. And this particular student chose to focus on King's concern with the church. He was a Christian clergyman, but he was sorely disappointed by his own church for their failure to contribute to justice in the civil rights movement. So the student, here's his thesis. He says, accordingly, Dr. King felt that the Christian church failed in providing strong support. Excuse me, I skipped a line. Christian church failed in its responsibility by not sufficiently supporting the anti-segregation movement. And here's the thesis, which also sets up the organization for his paper. He said King did so by providing strong support for his view. That's, of course, going to be his section on logos. By establishing credibility, that's going to be a section on ethos. And by reasoning carefully on the evidence and offering impassioned pleas. The impassioned pleas is the element of pathos. And I wish we had time to look at the entire essay, but let me just read his last paragraph. After the introduction, what he does is he has one paragraph on King's ethos building, all related to that topic of his disappointment with the church. The second body paragraph is he focuses on King's logos, where he presents his evidence of the failure of the church to get involved in the cause of justice. And here's the last body paragraph, this one focused on King's use of pathos. He says this. Again, this is a first-year student writing this paper. I'm really quite proud of him. Notice the transition first from the previous 2 paragraphs. He says, first, while such logos builds King's ethos, he, King, recognizes that he must also appeal to the reader's emotions if he hopes to persuade them to rethink their stands against him. So, of course, the word emotions there, synonym for pathos. Here's his evidence. Thus, King uses emotionally charged language and parallel sentence structure to arouse their Christian feelings. First, he reminds his readers of their commitment, and here he quotes from King, to love thy neighbor. Collectively, they must be the body of Christ. Yet his brother clerics have, quote, blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being a nonconformist. Certainly, Dr. King does take note of those valued few among the clergy who have broken away from, quote, the paralyzing chains of conformity. See, the point here is why I like this so much is the student is quoting figurative language which has an emotional appeal to it. The paralyzing chains of conformity. He doesn't just say, well, King wrote about how much pain it causes to be forced to conform. He uses a metaphor to describe what that feels like. It is a paralyzing chain. He goes on to say, it is important to note, here he's analyzing the quotation. It's important to note the use of paralyzing, for King uses it to suggest that the, quote, chains of the church make its members incapable of action. Dr. King finally warns that if the church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club. There he's quoting from King again. Appealing to the reader's fears as well as their guilt with these parallel verbs of loss, King warns of the church's moral decay. It's becoming an empty husk that will inevitably collapse into nothingness. If you can open up the PDF at some point and read this student's essay, what I just read will hit you more emphatically, I think, and you'll see what a great job this student does, not just with quoting King, but explaining why those quotes relate to the idea of building emotion to reinforce a logical argument. Basically, I wanted to draw your attention to this essay, and I do hope you read it later, because it'll persuade you that very young, inexperienced students, if well-trained, can do this kind of sophisticated writing. And he got, of course, he's a very brilliant young man, I'll admit, but he was able to write such a strong paper because of that journaling. Had he not done that, he would have, I'm convinced, written a much less successful paper. Now, on the screen you see here about journaling on Susan Glaspell's Trifles, I wanted to mention this just because this idea of journaling doesn't just prepare students to write about nonfiction, it can also prepare them to write about fiction. Susan Glaspell is an American author who wrote a one-act play called Trifles. If you'd like to read it yourself, it's in the PDF. You'll find it on page 160 through 172. So it's quite short. One-act play. So we're talking about fiction here. But as in the King assignment, notice these journaling questions force the students to dig deep into the play. And this is a play about two women, one of whom commits murder. She kills her husband. The other of whom tries to cover up that crime to protect her friend. And of course, normally nobody would be inclined to defend a murderer or a liar. But the evidence in the play slowly unfolds and unveils why the murder happened. Mrs. Wright originally was a sweet young woman who went to church all the time and loved to sing in the choir. And then she married Mr. Wright, who moved her out to a farm in Nebraska in the middle of nowhere, wouldn't ever let her go to church, wouldn't let her sing. They had no children ever because they never made love. She led a 30-year marriage with this man of total silence and emotional starvation. He never beat her up. There was no physical abuse, but all kinds of emotional abuse. Finally, one day, and this is encountered in question number 2 here, when the white men are examining the kitchen things they consider mere trifles, the women, not the men, but the women figure out what happened. Here's a woman who kept a spotless, clean kitchen, but at one point they see that the counter becomes quite sloppy, quite messy. What happened? The towels in that one place are also very dirty. Slowly, you see the paragraph references 30, 31, 40, 68. If the students go to those paragraphs, they'll find the detail that not only reveals what the kitchen looked like, but how Mrs. Hale, her friend, is starting to figure out about why this murder happened. If you don't know the story, here's the short version. the reason the murder happened is that after 30 years of loneliness and emotional cruelty, Mr. Hale decided that he couldn't take one more bird song. The only joy that Mrs. Wright had in her life was a little bird she had in a cage. And of course, it sang all the time, and she loved it. It basically kept her sane. One day, Mr. Hale said, "All right, that's enough of birds." He violently tore open the cage and strangled the bird. It's at that point, Mrs. Hale figures out, when Mrs. Wright snapped, she basically lost her rationality. And that very evening, she killed her husband just like he killed the bird. She strangled him using a rope. Question number 4 there takes them to paragraphs 115, 119, and 120, where they'll discover the, quote, horror that Mrs. Wright's friend, Mrs. Hale, when it finally dawns on her what happened to the strangled bird. Mr. Wright killed it, and that in turn is what happened to Mr. Wright. And it's at that point that Mrs. Hale decides to cover up from the men what happened. So once again, the point of such questions is it helps the students focus their reading of the play, but as they do that, they're gathering evidence that would help them defend what normally they would not be inclined to defend at all: murder and deception. So here's the assignment. I call this a mediational essay. So the students are writing about fiction, a play called Trifles, but they're writing a nonfiction mediational argument, which means basically they're trying to make peace. And here's the assignment. It's a role-playing editorial. In other words, it's calling for critical appraisal. But they're pretending in this role-playing exercise that they haven't read a play at all, that they actually lived this experience about this murder in this small town. So it says your editorial essay aims to make peace between the outraged men and the saddened women in Mrs. Wright's town. We're pretending now that the trial has taken place. The men are all outraged that a woman would murder her husband. This is back in the early 20th century, by the way, when it was completely legal for a man to do pretty much anything he wanted to his wife, and yet she murders him. So they think the death sentence is exactly what she deserves. They also feel no mercy for Mrs. Hale because she lied about it. She tried to hide her discovery about the murder. But then finally, as it says here at the end of the prompt, Mrs. Wright, in fact, murdered her husband, and Mrs. Hale obstructed justice. And here's how that happened. This is the where I give them the situation that are responding to. Mrs. Wright has just been sentenced to death. Again, the men are happy about that, and the women who understand why it happened are not happy about it. Mrs. Hale has also been found guilty of perjury. The jury was all male, and they reached the verdict unanimously after the prosecuting attorney pressured Mrs. Hale on the witness stand, pushing her to admit to having hid the strangled bird. So in the smaller type here, you see the assignment itself. Having witnessed a trial and interviewed Mrs. Hale in her cell, you have decided to write an editorial defending both Mrs. Wright for her murder and Mrs. Hale for her obstruction of justice and perjury. I emphasize here, I'm not asking them to write to defend murder or deception, but to plead for a lighter sentence on the grounds that the tyrannical husband was really the cause of all this. So it says in the last 2 sentences there, your purpose, your hope is to stir public sentiment to retry Mrs. Wright and to forgive the disgraced Mrs. Hale. And this last sentence here is where they would draw from their journaling. Use evidence from the play to make your case. So this is a nonfiction piece of writing that they're doing. It's a critical appraisal of the evidence in a piece of fiction, but they're pretending like it's not fiction at all, that it's a real event that happened in a real town. And most students end up having a lot of fun with this assignment. And I think they enjoy it probably more than writing about Martin Luther King's essay. But again, I would stress that what they're doing here is a critical appraisal. And what enables it is the evidence they derive from the journaling. Okay, we need to move on here. It's getting late. If I'm out of time, just tell me and I'll stop. But the second PDF has to do with asking students to write critical appraisals about poetry. Now, I don't know about your students, but my undergraduates tend to be of two types. If they're creative writing students, they love poetry already, but they don't necessarily get excited about analyzing it because they think that analyzing it ruins it somehow. It destroys its beauty. And the other students who are not creative writing students at all, just students in other majors, who absolutely think they hate poetry. And so they really resent the fact that they have a teacher asking them to write a critical appraisal of a poem. Their question is, why bother? What's the point? Well, this next slide gives you two very good answers from published poets, which is in the second PDF, the one on poetry. First one from Edward Hirsch, a practicing poet who recently passed away, by the way, but he wrote a book called How to Read a Poem. And a second quote from the African-American poet, Yusef Kouanyaka. You can read the quotes on your own, but basically they make the case that if you're going to write any kind of critical appraisal, whether it's of a poem or an essay or whatever, you need to establish reciprocity, exchange, respect for your audience. Kind of gets back to the concept of ethos. And Kouanyaka's quote really suggests that, well, if you're going to write an analytical essay, sometimes you could learn from poetry the value of indirection, playing around with ideas, playing around with language before you write your essay. So how do you prepare students to do that? How do you train them to appraise imagery so they can write an intelligent analysis of a poem? Once again, my answer would be primarily through journaling. But I've got two examples here which are in the PDF on poems, which you can read at your leisure later on if you're so inclined. First one is a poem by the American poet Robert Frost called Birches. The second one by the English poet William Wordsworth, a sonnet called The World Is Too Much With Us. Now, I use journaling here too, but before they do the journaling on the poems, I want them first to discover that a paraphrase is not the same thing as a poem. And I have an exercise that I'll refer to in a minute that does that. Then, these two poems that we're first mentioning here, Birches and The World Is Too Much With Us, are both nature poems. Robert Frost's poem is a beautiful two-pager, dense poem about the beauty of nature, but also about the cruelty of nature. It's on page 312. If you have that PDF and have it open, you'll find the poem itself. But what I want to draw your attention to first is this exercise I asked my students to do before they wrote their analytical essays on the poetry. First, I asked them to write a short narrative in their journal, a narrative about some experience they had in nature. And the selection I want to refer to you, if you've got the PDF, it's page 315. And I won't read the whole thing, we don't have enough time, but the student is writing a 3-paragraph journal entry here about her experience on a river in Savannah, Georgia. And it's one that she was afraid of because she had never guided a boat before. This was her first experience. And so it was both beautiful and exhilarating, but also terrifying. She wrote a very strong narrative journal entry about that experience. You see it highlighted here in the second bullet. And again, the whole point of doing that is to realize, and this goes back to something you learned from Mike Cardos, that if you want your students to write a poem, then you better help them discover that they can write from their own experience. So that's what this journal prompt is all about. Write about some experience you've had with nature. Doing that will persuade them that, hey, maybe a poem about nature isn't so silly after all. Maybe such poetry helps us understand how we relate to nature. The second stage of that, then, you see the third bullet here. I asked them to revise their journal entry into a poem. Well, the student did the same thing, and you'll find her poetic version on page 316 of the PDF. It's the next page. She turned that 3-paragraph prose narrative entry into a 4-paragraph poem. And let me just give you a few examples of her imagery, because that's really the point I'm making here, that you can use the journal to help your students learn how to create their own imagery. Once they've done that, they'll be much more receptive to the idea of analyzing somebody else's imagery. So in the second stanza, when she's referring to the beauty and exhilaration of being on the boat in the river, she doesn't just say, well, it was beautiful. She refers to the waves spitting spray. She refers to the white caps, the waves frolicking across the bow. And the last stanza where she's talking about the fear part, where the weather's getting rather violent and she's inexperienced and she's feeling really incompetent. But she has a line here that says, and she drew this from an image in her journal, her narrative version. She said, not storm winds, not wicked winds, as nature cat-like fixed her claws, and I in reverence, not fear, was glad that I was at the helm of so great and lenient wind. So you heard the figurative language there. She's talking about the wind and the exhilaration of it, but she compares it to a cat flexing its paws to get at the sense of invigoration she felt when that wind was blowing against her. Not a bad poem for her first attempt. This young woman didn't think of herself as a poet, but here she finds herself revising a prose journal entry into a poem and really having remarkable success. My whole contention here is that if they do that, they're going to be much more receptive to the idea of analyzing somebody else's poetry. Quick example from Frost, the Birches poem. It's on 312 in the PDF. Quite a long poem, but let me just give you a couple of examples of his use of figurative language. In the early part of the poem, he's talking about the beauty of nature. And again, he doesn't just talk in abstractions like we tend to do when we're paraphrasing a poem. He talks about what it's like to see an ice storm in the New England woods after the ice storm itself. And he says, as the breeze rises and turn the many-colored, as the stir cracks and crazes the enamel. There he's talking about literally the ice on the tree branches, but he compares them to cracking and crazing of enamel, as though it were pottery or something like that. Later in the poem, when he's talking about how this beautiful nature can also be quite cruel, he says, before we get to that, here's my favorite image in the poem, an image of beauty. He's wanting you to see exactly how beautiful a tree that has been permanently bent over by an ice storm is actually quite beautiful. He compares it to, he says, years after, they look, quote, like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. So, obviously you could teach your students at that point that that's the particular use of figurative language is called personification. The tree is compared to a young woman, but the point of the comparison is look how vivid, referring to the bent over tree as women's hair can be to convey a sense of how beautifully that struck the writer. And finally, near the end of the poem, when he's talking about the pain that sometimes comes from nature, he says, here's a famous quote. When I am weary of considerations, and life is too much like a pathless wood, something we might feel during this coronavirus, he says, and so I dream of going back. He's talking about going back to his youth. And life is too much, but here's what prevents him. He says, life is too much like a pathless wood, where your face burns and tickles with cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping where a twig has lashed across it open. If you've ever walked in the woods and had a twig from a tree cut your eyeball, you know exactly how much that hurts. So again, Frost's poem doesn't say in abstract terms, nature is beautiful and painful. Instead, he gives us imagery. It teaches us that. Images of beauty, images of pain. And that's what the students would be analyzing if they write on Birches. Do I have time to go on? Okay, I guess that's yes. Two other poems that are in the PDF. One is Shakespeare's Son at That Time of Year. The other one is Wilfred Owen's poem, Dulce at the Cornmist. I use these two poems to teach the students about poetic structure and rhyme and meter and other sound effects like alliteration and cacophony. Since we're running out of time here, let me just turn to, I'll skip over Shakespeare, which by the way, you'll find on page 317 in the PDF. There's analysis of it in the pages following. But Wilfred Owen's poem occurs on 320. Wilfred Owen was in World War I. In fact, he died in the trenches in World War I, but he was also a poet, and he wrote this famous poem about the hell of war. And he uses not just visual imagery, but he uses sound imagery, ugly sounds, cacophonous sounds. One part, for example, when he's describing what it looks like to be these men marching along in their exhaustion, and all of a sudden they're attacked by a gas bomb, and they're all scrambling to get on their gas masks. One soldier doesn't make it, and he describes him, and listen to the cacophony here, the onomatopoeia, the ugly, rough sounds. I see him in an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmet just in time, but someone was still yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Skipping down a few lines, he refers to that dying man as, quote, guttering, choking, drowning. When he's almost dead, and they throw him into a wagon to cart him off, and he describes this dying soldier's tortured face this way. He calls it a hanging face, like a devil's, sick of sin. So again, if the students are doing journal entries on such poetry, they're discovering the tools that the poet used, visual imagery, but also sound imagery, to create a sensory experience for us, in this case, one that teaches us, as close as a poem can come to doing, what it's like to be in a war. Last example here is about two poems, one by Elizabeth Bishop called The Fish, and the other one by Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, called Digging. And again, I use the technique of journaling. Here are journal prompts on the Bishop poem, which you will find on page 326, 328 in the poetry PDF. Again, we don't have time to go through this whole poem, unfortunately, but she too uses imagery. And you know, this poem is really fun because the very first line, if you're a fisherman, you can relate definitely to the first and the last line. I know my students can, because the first line says, I caught a tremendous fish. And the last line says, I let the fish go. Now, my students are immediately want to know what kind of crazy fisherman would go to the trouble to catch a fish and then let it go. Well, and of course, the point is that the imagery in the poem teaches us, helps us understand why the speaker basically learns to love this ugly old fish and doesn't have the heart to put it in a frying pan and cook it up. He lets it go. Let me give you just a couple of examples. In the early part of the poem where he's describing this huge old ugly fish, the way it looks like when he pulls it out of the water. He refers to its brown scales, and he calls them like wallpaper. He talks about the barnacles that are on the fish, like rosettes of lime. This is not a pretty fish. He talks about the sea lice that are clinging on it. But the more he looks, the more she starts seeing beauty. Pretty soon, the white flesh, she says, is like feathers. The bladder like a big peony. Moving on, he describes the eyes as almost human eyes. And then near the very end, she describes this fish who's been caught many times before, apparently, because he's got hanging from his chin, broken fish line coming out of hooks that have been stuck in his mouth all these years. And she looks at that and she says, I admired his sullen face, the mechanisms of his jaw. I saw that from his lower lip, you could call it a lip, grim, wet, weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line. And she goes on with this description, and she compares the dangling fish lines to medals, that a soldier would win, for example. She calls the fish lines his 5-haired beard of wisdom. So by the end, she's personifying this fish into almost kind of a war hero. And that's why she can't, that's why she throws it back. She's discovered, the paradox here, that part of nature that is really quite grotesque, quite ugly, if we look closely enough, is really quite beautiful. And again, the journaling teaches the students the analytical skills they'll need to write an essay on the fish, or on Seamus Heaney's poem, Digging. Seamus Heaney, of course, won the Nobel Prize for Poetry back in 1996. And this poem is about his experience as a young boy in Northern Ireland. And it's called Digging because it's a meditation remembering first his father outside his window digging a rose garden. And then in the next stanza, he remembers his grandfather decades earlier, not digging a rose garden at all, but digging fuel to burn in a stove, because these were Irish in Northern Ireland and they're impoverished, and this is what they need to cook their food. And of course, the imagery teaches the student that, metaphorically speaking, Heaney is not just remembering his father and his grandfather and the work that they did with shovels. He's seeing the connection between their work, which is quite literal digging, with the work that he does metaphorically with his pen. In the beginning of the poem, you'll see question 3 there. He calls his pen a gun, which I think is probably a reference to the Troubles in Ireland, the Civil War between the Catholics and the Protestants. But by the end of the poem, the pen, which he mentions again, is not a gun anymore. He calls it his spade, his shovel. And the last line of the poem says, I'll dig with it. My hope here is the students will learn through analyzing the imagery so closely that this is not a frivolous nature poem at all, that Heaney is really making quite a serious statement about the importance of hard work, because it's something that creates beauty and it's something that creates sustenance. And all of us, whatever path we take in life, hopefully are discovering a spade, a shovel, something we can pick up and dig with and find a meaningful life.
Okay, Rich, I wonder whether you can, I don't know, you can like sum up things if you can, because it's a little bit getting late and we need
Yes.
also to receive some questions.
Sure.
So,
okay, well, I'll just mention the other slides and then I'll stop. Here are the topics on poetry. The first one calls for a narrative essay. The second one for an analytical one. Again, my contention is that having done the journaling, they can actually do this. Here's another topic, same as the one before, only focusing on Birches or on the Wordsworth poem. Or the second topic here, focusing on Heaney's Digging. And the last section, which we don't have time for at all, but I hope you read it, it's in the PDF called Reflective Writing. And what I'm arguing here, as these quotes suggest on this slide, is that by asking your students to build a portfolio of their own work, two things are going to happen if you give them proper guidance. One is they'll learn to do a critical assessment of their own writing so that they can discover where and how they've grown as writers in your course. This would work in creative writing class or a composition class or a literature class. And the last claim I'm going to make here is that if you use this portfolio technique, you can not only use it to assess individual students' writing, but you could accumulate the results and use it to assess the success of your own program. And you'll find that these remaining slides are about that. So here I suggest the content for the portfolio. Here is a rubric for assessing a portfolio. If any of you have any questions about this that we don't get to ask now, I'd be happy for you to email me or Zoom me and we can talk about this further. Okay, so what are your questions?
All right, professors, I have one professor that raised his hand. Her name is Iman. So would you please limit your question to one and please be my guest. Iman, are you available? Iman? Anybody with the name Iman? Nobody? We can take another question, professors, if you have any wonderings, anything to comment, to add. Okay.
دكتورة عنان خليه يسوي رايز هاند من فضلك اللي يريد.
Well, I asked them.
يبقى سؤال.
We have Iman who raised her hands, or we have iPhone without a name. We have Dr. Qasim Sarhan. Okay, we have one with the name iPhone. Would you please, who is with this? Just the name of the device. iPhone. Who is he? Who is she?
Haytham.
Oh, you are.
تفضل أستاذ هيثم.
Be my guest, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you for exerting such an effort and such a very well informing and well organized presentation. Actually, that critical appraisal of literary works is what we do actually as a professors, and what we enable our students to do. I have only one simple question. There has been an argument in our department a few weeks ago about whether critical appraisal can be considered as creative writing or outside creative writing. So would you please enlighten us on this particular issue? Thank you very much.
Excellent question. Thank you for that. Can you see the book I'm holding up here?
Yes, I see that. Yeah.
Those of you who attended Dr. Carter's session may, I highly recommend this book to you, by the way. It's called The Art and Craft of Fiction. It's published by Bedford St. Martin's. And it's basically a guide for writers and for teachers who are teaching creative writing. And I mention this here because Michael's answer to your question is, by all means, that critical appraisal is what creative writers do when they're sharing drafts in a response group. They're using guidelines for responding to assess where a poem is working or where it's not working. Same thing would be true of fiction. And by the way, Mike Carlos's book also talks about journaling prompts. He talks about, if you want your students to write poetry with imagery, the first thing you need to do is help them discover through a journal that they can actually create their own images. That's a tremendous confidence builder. So my answer to your question is yes, at least in my opinion, critical appraisal should happen in academic writing, but also in creative writing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haytham. We will move to Professor Ahmed Saleh. Ahmed Saleh, are you there? Professor Ahmed. Okay, in this case, I will move to Sherwan. Sherwan Saber or Sherwan. Can you hear me, Professor Saber? Okay, I don't think, maybe they have some issues with their connection. I will move to Dr. Alia. Alia Nasser.
دكتور علياء تفضلي.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Raymond, and thanks a lot, Dr. Anan and Dr. Muhammad, for facilitating this wonderful talk. I just want to ask Professor Raymond if he can guide me, because I teach drama in the Department of English, and normally what caught my attention is your idea of role playing by the students, when you encourage your students to role play the text that are working on, so that they can reach to a kind of a level of reflective writing.
Yes.
My question is that we think how can you bridge the gap? For example, when I'm teaching moral plays or Shakespearean drama to students of our days, you know, of our contemporary times. Sometimes when I ask them to role play, they would say such thing would never happen, or such thing would never happen. This kind of gap, the time gap between the text that we study and the situations that the students live, may raise the question of becoming unbelievable to them sometimes. And therefore,
Right.
what I do is that I sometimes encourage them to take the theme or the idea behind the scene itself and play and put themselves in. And thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. I love that question. If I can use the example of the Trifles play that I referred to, I think that could pretty readily be adapted to a creative writing class focused on playwriting. The play itself, again, it's on 160 through 72, I think, of the PDF. Yeah, it's just a one-act play, but it doesn't include a trial. At the point at the end of the play, the murder has been discovered. The cause of the murder has been discovered by the women, but there hasn't been a trial yet. But if you contextualize the play for the students, they know this was written in America on the vast American plains in Nebraska back in the early 20th century. And it was a time when women had zero authority. They were the property of their men. And so that no matter how shocking the emotional abuse in the play is, which I think your students will find quite, alas, it's still happening, domestic abuse. Your assignment as a creative writing teacher could be write an act 2. You know, it's a one-act play. Write act 2 where the evidence goes to trial. And the situation you would set up is, well, you know you're going to have a town full of men who know nothing about why this murder happened. They only know that a crazy wife murdered her husband, and they want her to die for it. So they're prejudiced. They do not want to hear any sympathetic argument for this woman. And they're almost as hostile toward the idea of forgiving Mrs. Hale. She doesn't commit murder, but she does in the play, the one-act play, lie to the sheriff. She suppresses evidence. That's a felony, right? So your assignment in creative writing could be, okay, students, act 2. You could update it to 2020. It doesn't have to be 1920 or 1910. Update it to the current time. but do a second act where you imagine how the trial goes and to what extent the evidence of why the murder happened gets to come out. Is the evidence suppressed? Does the evidence come out? And see, that would be totally up to their imagination to decide on. And I think they would have great fun with it, I would think. But it'd also be, I think, a challenging assignment, and certainly would qualify as critical assessment, critical.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. We'll try again with Dr. Haidar. Sorry, Ahmed Saber. دكتور محمد ممكن تفتح الميكروفون على الكل لأنه كثير أكو أشخاص ما يقدرون ما أعرف ما يعرفون يرفعون إيدهم. The problem is that professors you are not raising hands. Once you raise your hands you can unmute yourselves.
بس الأساتذة الأفاضل رجاء موجود أسفل الشاشة جهة اليسار موجود علامة الكف، اضغط عليها فقط راح يطلع ريز هاند أمام المحاضر والدكتورة عنان على مود نعرف منه اللي يرفع ايده، لأنه للأسف تطلع اسماء أجهزة آيفون جالكسي فما نعرف من الشخص اللي يسأل. رجاء فقط خلي علامة الكف ريز هاند.
Now we will have Bassem, Professor Bassem.
نعم تفضل دكتور باسم. دكتور باسم تفضل.
Thank you. Just a minute. Yeah, I know. Just a minute. I've done that. Thank you, Raymond, for being with us. Thank you, everybody. Now, my question relates to the types of essays. You grappled with. This today. In what I understood that you tackled a number of essays. The most important. Two of them are the critique and the analysis essay.
Yes.
Right? Did I get that right?
Yes.
So, I think you grouped the two kinds of essays in one group. And I believe, due to my experience, because I taught that, for a long time in America, these, cannot be grouped together because, in the analysis essay, we have to begin with a kind of definition or criteria, through which, we can analyze. Yes, we have the formal, things, and almost the same. Formally, they are similar, but the way we go down that road, is different. In the kind of critique, we begin with the summary and we go along that line. We can have induction and deduction, in both cases. But in the case of the analysis essay, we should begin, practically with a criterion or a definition. And using that, we can do the analysis. Without that, without beginning with that, we cannot do any convincing and persuasive analysis. What do you think of that?
I agree with you, but first of all, I would say that the definitions from Aristotle are the beginning, the forming of a rubric by which they can use.
I do agree with that. In both cases, we have that.
Yeah, but if you're talking about a template for their writing, one approach I take to that, I didn't include it in the slideshow, but at the very beginning of the course, I provide my students with a guide for evaluating essays, and it highlights primarily content, thesis, support, imagery, that kind of thing. And earlier in the course, before they get to this work on Martin Luther King, for example, they read some simpler pieces, some shorter pieces, and I've already introduced to them ethos, logos, and pathos. So by the time they get to King, they've heard those terms before. I quite agree with you. You can't just dive in with Aristotle. There needs to be more prefacing than that. But my contention was, and I think you'll find that if you can read that model student essay on Martin Luther King, you can see that it does in fact include a summary, not of the entire letter, because the letter is too long, it's 15 pages, but it includes a thorough summary of what King said about why he was so disappointed with his own church. Then within his essay, he explains, which was the assignment, to explain how King blends the elements of ethos, logos, and pathos to make that claim clear that the church that he loved so much was not behaving as it should. If you read King's letter first and then read the student's essay, you'll see that it does not summarize the entire letter, because I'm asking them to write a 3 or 4 page paper. King's essay.
I do remember that, because this is, it seems that this is a classic example of, a good essay. King's essay, because I assigned that, to my students. I remember that. So it is a classic example of, a very good, persuasive essay.
Yeah, so I think you and I really have no disagreement. I completely agree that students need to be provided with models at every opportunity. They need rubrics so that they know what the objectives are.
Sure.
And definitions of what success looks like. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bassem. We will move to Dr. Qasim. قاسم سرحان.
تفضل دكتور قاسم. دكتور قاسم تفضل.
Are you there?
دكتور
Maybe he's
قاسم.
of some difficulty in. I have then to move. I'm sorry, I have to move to Talib.
أستاذ طالب تفضل. أستاذ طالب.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I have 2 questions regarding appraisal. First of all, when it comes to appraisal, it's more related to the evaluation of the language. The question is, that was the difference between appraisal and the academic, modality and hedging in academic writing. And is the appraisal based on the notion of the stand? I'd like to get the answers from the professor. Thank you.
Okay, on my end, you were breaking up there a little bit. I'm not sure I heard you completely, but if you are talking about assessing the work, the last section that I really didn't get to talk about on portfolios and reflective writing, you'll find there that there is a rubric for rating an individual piece of writing, but also rating a portfolio, which is a collection of students' writing. And the criteria are really quite specific. And they focus, like we've been talking about, on critical appraisal, with most of the emphasis being placed on analysis, supporting claims with evidence. I'm not sure if I caught the gist of your question, but if I'm on the right track there, I think you'll find that last PDF on reflective writing will be useful to you.
Okay, thank you. I will move to now to Professor Sherwan. Now you can join us now. Sherwan Saber.
Okay, hello.
Yes, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Raymond. Obviously, I just wanted to say that our ways of teaching English language in, let's say, Iraq, as let's say, and even in Kurdistan region, so there are 2 systems of education. So they are still, let's say we are still applying structural views of language teaching. So we say it is functional views, or I don't know, so interactional views, communicative views, but we are still teaching language itself. So our students are not capable of, let's say, analyzing or let's say thinking critically. So this is one. Another one is, as Mr. Talib said, is, let's say, evaluation. So the majority of the students, when they try to analyze a text, they directly go to evaluation. So they forget we have to describe. So we cannot evaluate. We have to describe. In this case, one of the problems is, let's say, is honesty in appraisal, in honesty in critical appraisal. So yes, thank you, Professor. So could you tell me, please, how to, let's say, cope with these, let's say, problems in, let's say, in reflective writing?
That's an excellent question. One aspect of my approach that I didn't even mention here is that when I talked about the journaling and pre-writing so that they can be ready to write a formal academic paper, but there are intermediate steps that I didn't even mention which relate to your question. For example, after my students write a rough draft of an essay on a given assignment, I do not have them turn it in to me immediately at all. Instead, I have them get in peer response groups. And you're right, they have trouble sometimes with being honest, at least until they get the hang of the procedure. But if you like, I could send you all guidelines for peer responding that I use. And that's really the main pitch that I make, that the peer responding, frankly, is a waste of time unless the responder is honest and specific. So if you, for example, you would say, it wouldn't be okay to say, oh, I love your introduction. Instead, you'd have to say, I love your introduction because. And then you'd explain, if you're the responder, what it is in the introduction you found effective. Or let's say you're talking about a body paragraph and your partner's rough draft. You can't say, well, that was really a great thesis. You say, you know, I appreciate your claim there. And I think some of the evidence you present is quite persuasive, but did you consider X or did you consider Y? If the students have read the same text, they can actually do that for one another. Now I emphasize, to get back to your question, the idea of ownership. Like if you and I are sitting in the peer response group and you make a suggestion to me, I can follow it if I think it makes sense, or I can reject it if I think you're wrong. Ownership is always with the writer. But if you have made both an oral and a written response to my work that praises what you find praiseworthy and explains why you thought it was effective, and then conversely, if you identify where you found the paper not very convincing or where you found it confusing, given the fact that it's a rough draft, I'm not going to be offended. I'm going to be grateful to you for having pointed out to me where I wasn't very clear. And then I will revise the paper. Version 2 is the first one that comes to me. And my students all submit everything online now. So what they're submitting to me is the revision of their rough draft together with the sharing of the peer response sheet. So I know what the critique was, what they're responding to, and what decisions they made to fix the paper. I shouldn't use the word fix because that suggests we're talking about punctuation and that mechanical stuff. Not that that's not important, but the peer response is focused on content. Then there is a version 3. In other words, every paper that my students write for me goes through 3 versions. Only the third one gets the final grade. On the second version, I submit comments and suggestions and a tentative grade. They revise again, and then they get the final grade. So it's a process. It starts with journaling and other forms of pre-writing. It moves to rough drafting independently, then to peer response groups with guidelines from me, because you're quite right. If you don't have specific criteria, the students, particularly when they're insecure and not sure what they're doing, they'll lapse into vague compliments or vague insults, and nothing productive happens. But with the guidelines, I have found that more often than not, it's really quite useful. Then again, step 3, they revise for me. Step 4, they revise again for me. So I would maintain that the writing gets better partly because of this 3-step process of revision. I'm convinced, and I think Michael Cardos says the same thing in his book, revision is where writers learn how to write. Mm-hmm. So I think it's wise to not only allow, but to require revision and to reward it when it's successful. But my other contention that I stressed during the slide presentation was that if you want to give your students a fighting chance, particularly if they're inexperienced, to write a critical appraisal of an essay or a play or whatever it is, try journaling. The journaling is critical assessment, which helps students, without the pressure of a grade, generate the information that they can then put in their paper. It's a lot less intimidating to write a challenging paper if you've got the evidence sitting in front of you in your own journal.
We have two more professors who have questions. They will be the last one because it's getting late a little bit.
Okay.
We have Dr. Qasim. He was trying so hard from the beginning. Only two. I'll take only two questions. Dr. Qasim.
تفضل دكتور قاسم. دكتور قاسم تفضل.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
I'm sorry, but I have been trying to make my point. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Anan, and thank you very much also the professor for this invaluable lecture. My name is Dr. Qasim Salman, University of Al-Qadisiyah, Department of English. The first comment is, can we really have a ready-made set of thumbs or tactics or a schema of critical appraisal that everybody can apply, can learn and apply to write a critical appraisal? I myself doubt this actually, because there is much in writing a critical appraisal. There is much which depends on value judgments, in fact. Having an aesthetic sense, the ability to read and appreciate poetry on its own, having an aesthetic sense, and having a musical ear, for instance, to appreciate poetry, I believe that this is something innate, and no ready-made, cliched set of thumbs or actually tactics can raise or can convert somebody to that high level of appreciating and appraising poetry. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, this is a question for you, my respectable professor, is that no reader, of course, you know, no student comes fresh to any literary text. Any student or reader inevitably brings with him his own cultural, racial background, his own biases, his own preferences, which inevitably will, in fact, affect his appraisal of the poem. And therefore, out of my experience, I have noticed that students always instill their own ideas and they instill their own impressions about our own text. And sometimes they twist text actually to mean what they want them to mean. So, sure. Because as you know, writing a critical appraisal inevitably means taking stands, moral stands, and ideological stands.
Okay, Dr.
Can we actually,
please, like, try to be.
The question is, can we really help students to write an objective critical appraisal and to belittle such orientation, ideological orientation onto the text? And thank you very much again.
Yes, well, you make some very convincing and I think accurate observations about the nature of genius. And that's not something we all necessarily have in terms of creative writing or essay writing. But for those who are not of the genius level, I think we can still make progress in helping our students realize that they can and indeed use language to make a claim based on a discovery they have made and then to support it. One way to get at the problem of objectivity or the lack thereof, because you're right, we all have our prejudices. If you have the chance to look at the PDF on poetry, after the assignment, for example, the one on Seamus Heaney or Robert Frost, any of those, you'll see the last couple of sentences say, imagine that you're writing this not to someone who loves poetry at all, quite the opposite. You're writing your paper talking about the brilliance of digging Seamus Heaney's poem, to someone who thinks that poetry is an absolute waste of time, it's got nothing useful to teach any of us about work or meaningful living. And if you look at the other topics, I have that same rhetorical situation, which if nothing else reminds the students that in the real world, when we try to do a critical appraisal for an audience, your audience is very likely going to have people in it who are bored and don't care about your topic at all, or they're hostile to it, like Martin Luther King's audience. You couldn't have asked for a more hostile audience than that. So can we be utterly objective? No, impossible. But I think we can put together criteria for at least talking about what constitutes effective argumentation. And then we could keep the focus on not the professor, but on the audience for a given piece, which is not the professor, but the audience you're trying to enlighten or convince. Or when you think about all analytical writing, you're either asking your audience to change their mind or to do something. That's what King was doing, for example. He was trying to get his fellow clergymen to realize that what they were advocating was racism, which obviously isn't consistent with Christianity. To persuade them of that, again, they did accuse him of being biased, and surely he had biases like we all do. But that's the reason that letter is so long. He crams as much evidence as he possibly could think of as to why being segregated is a sin. Now, does that ultimately prove anything? Not necessarily. The essay ends, and the ball is in the court, so to speak, of the readers. They can reject it out of hand and say, well, that was just a bunch of bias, and I don't buy the support for the argument. Or, in those times when we succeed, we don't necessarily create a convert. Our audience may still oppose our view, but at least we've presented enough logos, enough evidence to get them, as Shakespeare says, lend me your ear. Let me at least consider your argument. I still disagree with it, but I think it's worthy of listening to. Whereas before, I might not have even been willing to listen.
Okay, thank you, Rich. We have one last question. Dr. Wafa, can you hear me? Are you there? Dr. Wafa. Dr. Wafa, are you there? I think she can mute herself.
Yes.
Are you
hi.
with us?
Yes. I have just got the unmute. Good evening, dear Anan, and good evening, Professor Raymond. It's very interesting topic, and it's really enriching experience to have or to listen to such a lecture that gives us your experience in teaching literature. My question is this. I'm sorry that my internet was intermittent, so I missed some of the points. And maybe my question is going to be like asking him to repeat something, but not everything, but very briefly. I think Dr. Raymond is presenting to us teaching methodology of literature. Or am I wrong in that? Or is it, or what kind of genre? Dr. Raymond, are you giving us? Is it a genre of writing a critical essay of a literary work, or are you telling us how to teach a literary work? Thank you so much.
Very good question. Actually, the 3 PDFs, which you either have or can get from Anan, all come from this book here that I wrote. It's a textbook a number of years ago. And it's aimed at first year or freshman students. And the assignments that I shared in my slide presentation were focused really at that level. But I would argue that particularly that assignment on King is really quite challenging. I've given that same assignment with a little broader expectations to graduate students. And to me, that's one secret of effective teaching, which I know you all know about, and that is keep the bar high. Don't underestimate your students. Give them the compliment of your believing that they can do something that's quite demanding. And that was really my point about journaling and other such activities, that if we give them the tools they need to do work that they think they can't do, they can, in fact, more cases than not, rise to the challenge. I had this experience most poignantly back when I lived in Mississippi, teaching in Mississippi State. One semester I worked in an infamous place called Parchman Prison. It's the state penitentiary in Mississippi. And for decades, if not longer, it's been known as basically a hellhole. But the university paid the tuition of my 15 students. They were all convicted criminals. None of them had been convicted of violent crimes, but most of them were guilty of selling drugs or stealing something. But nevertheless, they were in a penitentiary, not a pleasant one at all. Well, guess what I taught them? I taught them Martin Luther King. I also taught them a novel by the African-American novelist Ernest Gaines called A Lesson Before Dying, which is a powerful short novel about a young Black man on death row for a crime he did not commit. By the end of the novel, unfortunately, he dies in the electric chair. But in the process, the reader of the book, just like the people in the fictional town, have learned to appreciate that he was indeed a man and not a beast of some sort, a mere criminal. And the last image of that novel, which is really kind of pre-Martin Luther King, the novel was written in 1994, but it's set in 1947. And at the end of this novel, set in racist Louisiana, this execution story, a white deputy sheriff and a Black teacher shake hands. They've become friends in this process of dealing with the young man before he got executed. So it's a grim, dark novel, but amazingly, it also gives us some hope. And I guess to get back to your question, if these techniques can work for convicted felons, many of whom have given up on life and figure the system is rigged against them and they could never, language will never help them get out of their cage. This kind of writing will help them totally change. It won't get them out of jail yet, no, but it will change the way they think about themselves so that mental prison ceases to exist, so they learn how to write and how to read critically.
Thank you, Dr. Wafa. Thank you, Rich. I think we come to the end of, those who, like perhaps some professors wanted to ask questions, but with the connection, it's a little bit an obstacle. Well, of course, like this presentation for us was quite illuminating. Most of us actually, in almost on our universities and Department of English, we don't have that course of a critical appraisal. So that was really enriching for us. Perhaps some of professors actually, they are doing that with their students as they teach drama, poetry, fiction in general. But without having like a specific course for it. But we actually need these, like the techniques of teaching, and that was really helping. With the PDF, I'll try to send it to the rest of the professors, but I don't know them all, but I'll do my best. I have like one question also related to the audience. You in your book you mentioned something about like a critical appraisal requires knowing your audience, right? So how far is this related to to the culture, to the mentality of the audience? As one would take a work of art and would write an essay, critical appraisal about it, and would the essays address, perhaps he wouldn't address the the proper or the exact audience from which this work of art was published, but other other audiences. So in this case, how far the audience would have an impact, the culture, the mentality of the audience on the writing, on the critical appraisal?
Good question. Again, I'll go back to those poetry topics, which invite audience analysis. In class, or we can do this online as well, we actually talk about that very question. And what difference would it make if you're writing to someone who hates poetry or thinks that it's silly or a waste of time? Knowing that about your audience, what does that tell you about the depth of specificity that you're going to have to include in your essay? This gets back to the earlier gentleman's question, to be persuasive. You can't just respond by saying, well, you're wrong, poetry is really quite beautiful and teaches us many truths. You have to demonstrate it. You have to provide the evidence. By the time your paper's over, they may still not particularly like poetry, but if you succeeded at all, they realize that Seamus Heaney actually has something worth saying about shovels as a metaphor for meaningful work. But that's not going to sink in if you don't have the discussion with your students about exactly what you mentioned there, Anand. What difference does that audience make? If they think, well, I'm writing this for my teacher, Professor Raymond, they have the feeling of jumping through an academic hoop, but it's not meaningful writing. The very last, in that last PDF I sent you on reflective writing, it refers to an essay by Anne Lamott, which is actually at the end of that PDF. And that she says, for any kind of writing, two things are ultimately the most important. One is, do you care? Do you actually know something about the topic, and do you actually care, going back to Anand's question, about your audience? Do you want them to get it? And does Martin Luther King really love these clergymen who publicly criticized him? He'd better, if he hopes to be persuasive. So audience analysis, this is something that I have easier time teaching in technical writing, where it's all about writing for a particular audience. But I would take this to be true in any kind of writing situation, that if we can think about, what do I believe? What do I know to be true? Who needs to know this? What are their biases and prejudices bound to prevent them from hearing or want to hear? And what can I do by way of providing examples and supports to at least get them to listen? It's not to be totally persuaded. And that exercise, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But if you don't ask those questions, your piece of writing will probably not hit a target, because you haven't thought about who the target is.
True. Oh, thank you. Of course, this raises the question of, like, why am I a writer? Why would I write? Who would care? And definitely.
By the way, let me mention one other thing. I meant to say this earlier, but the techniques I shared today were for a first-year class, but I use very much the same pedagogy when I'm teaching a graduate class, for the same reasons. Graduate students don't necessarily know how to do a critical analysis, or they need deeper experience. It doesn't do much good to say, write a paper. It's much more useful to give them the tools they need to figure out how to do that paper. Much better results, I've found.
Definitely. Thank you, Rich, very much. It was really interesting, and I know it's getting late. Sorry for I'm sure that all the professors or the participants have enjoyed your presentation, and we didn't feel the time. It's now it's 11 p.m. here almost.
Oh no.
No. But it's fine, because everybody home, and because of COVID-19. So we are trying to make the utmost of our time as much as possible to be useful and interesting. Thank you very much again on behalf of my department and the College of Arts, University of Baghdad, on behalf of all the participants of different universities that they joined us. We hope that we can perhaps have further meetings in the future, in the coming future. that will be really like it would mean a lot for us, academically enriching. And yes.
Well, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you have my email address. So if I could send any of you any documents that you'd like to see or any further discussions you want to have, we can do it on Zoom or just by email, whatever you want. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you very much. Like who stayed with us, like you can see Professor Raymond's email on his video, on the picture. So you can, like, if it is okay for you, they can email you, right? Because I think that, like, your email is showing on on the video, or you can just write him, and you can even email me, professors, to send you the PDFs. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad, for for helping us making this meeting possible. And on behalf of the head of the department who couldn't join us because of connection problems and electricity, we still suffer of all these things. He thanks you a lot, and well, we hope for further meetings in the future. Thank you, Rich. Have a good day. Good night. Thank you.
Have a good day.
شكرا دكتور محمد.
شكرا لك دكتورة.
شكرا، مع السلامة.
مع السلامة.